Her plane touched down on a frozen, muddy runway, carrying the weight of her divorce from Joe DiMaggio, but the cold instantly shattered her focus when she saw a young soldier wheeled out, a man the doctors said was close to his end, who had used his final wish not for treatment, but for 5 selfless words. Her plane touched down on a frozen, muddy runway, not in the glamour she was used to, but in the brutal, silent cold of a war zone. The ramp dropped onto the churned earth of Busan, South Korea, and for the first time in years, the most famous woman in the world stepped off a plane and felt utterly invisible. Not to the soldiers, but to the blinding spotlight of her own misery. It was February 1954, barely a month after the crushing public collapse of her marriage to Joe DiMaggio, and Marilyn Monroe had traded Hollywood's lies for the stark, unforgiving truth of war. She had come seeking refuge, chasing a desperate hope that the profound reality of human suffering might somehow overshadow the trivial, unbearable ache in her own heart. The air was thin, biting, and smelled not of expensive perfume and grease paint, but of cold metal and distant fear. Everywhere she looked, there was mud, thick, frozen, ugly mud that clung to her shimmering satin dress and her perfectly white fur collar, a brutal, immediate contrast to the carefully constructed fantasy she usually inhabited. This wasn't a movie set. There were no retakes, only the quiet, haunted eyes of young men who had seen too much. Marilyn had believed the marriage to Joe was her final escape, her chance to finally be Norma Jean, the wife, protected from the world's cold scrutiny. When the marriage failed so publicly, the feeling was not just heartbreak. It was a devastating humiliation. She felt like an item discarded, a beautiful commodity proven faulty. Hollywood was a lie, and love, she feared, was the biggest illusion of all. She desperately needed to find a place where the feeling of being real eclipsed the performance. Marilyn arrived with the intention of giving them a memory, a flash of dizzying beauty. The men of the 1st Marine Division gave her something back: authenticity. They weren't fawning fans. They were men who had faced the end, and their devotion felt raw, honest, and painfully urgent. They weren't cheering for a poster. They were cheering for a dream of life itself. But even amidst the applause, Marilyn felt the weight of her facade. She was tired of being the shimmering illusion. She felt like a glass ornament on a battlefield. She had flown nearly 7,000 miles to escape heartbreak, only to find the silence between the cheers amplified the emptiness inside her. She felt the tremendous, impossible burden of being the only thing separating these boys from the terror that waited beyond the hills. The stage was a makeshift platform, barely safe. She stood backstage, shivering, listening to the roar of the crowd, adjusting her makeup in a small, cracked mirror. This performance had to be perfect. She was their last piece of civilization. She took a deep breath, fighting the sudden, terrifying urge to run away. But the curtains opened, and the lights hit her, and the transformation was instantaneous. She became Marilyn, the goddess. Yet, as she moved to the center of the stage, she heard a stagehand whisper, "He won't last the day," but he insisted on seeing her. She saw a young Marine being wheeled to the front, and the sheer tragedy of his presence instantly demanded the realest part of her soul. Out of the thousands of men gathered in the snow, she saw one face that didn't cheer, didn't smile, and didn't even look like he was breathing properly. This was Private First Class Robert "Robbie" Vance, a 21-year-old Marine from Kansas whose life had been measured by all medical accounts in mere days. He was a phantom amidst the noise, a silent sentinel in a crowd that roared with desperate joy. Robbie had taken shrapnel to the lungs just 3 weeks prior. The field doctors had been clear. His condition was terminal. When the announcement came that Marilyn Monroe was performing just a quarter-mile from his field hospital bed, Robbie found a reserve of strength no one knew he possessed. His request wasn't for comfort or pain relief, it was simply to see her, one last time. The weary medic who wheeled him out that morning, Sergeant Miller, tried to argue. The cold, the wind, it was too much. But Robbie simply looked up with those pale, exhausted eyes and said, "She's the only beautiful thing I've thought about in 6 months, Sarge. I need to see beauty before I go." Miller couldn't deny him. He covered Robbie with every blanket they had and pushed his stretcher through the thick, half-frozen mud. Robbie was a stark, almost horrifying contrast to the scene. He weighed maybe 90 pounds, his face ghostly white, his body barely visible beneath the padding. The other soldiers instinctively created a quiet, respectful circle around him. They knew the truth. But the most striking thing about Robbie wasn't his frailty. It was his focus. His gaze was fixed, unwavering, upon the curtain where Marilyn waited. He was looking at the woman. He had a private mission he hadn't shared. It wasn't about autographs or pinups. Robbie's father had been an alcoholic who abandoned his family. His mother, Mary, worked 3 jobs and often cried herself to sleep. The only consistent comfort had been the flickering image of Marilyn Monroe on the cinema screen. For Robbie, seeing Marilyn wasn't just about escape. It was about honoring his mother's one small, genuine joy. He needed to deliver a silent message, a final, selfless and thought. Robbie's childhood hadn't been filled with toys or easy laughter. It was filled with the metallic scent of his mother's exhaustion. He remembered sitting by the small radio, listening to the glamorous music of Hollywood and watching his mother, even after a 14-hour shift, manage a fleeting smile whenever Marilyn appeared on screen. That smile, so rare and so precious, was the only thing that made the poverty and the loneliness bearable. He knew that the star was the talisman of his mother's happiness. Robbie had clung to this memory through the 3 weeks since his injury. The 5 words he carried were the last, best offering he could make to the woman who had cried alone for him so many nights. He knew he wouldn't make it back home to Kansas. He knew his mother would grieve terribly. If he could just see Marilyn, he hoped he could somehow communicate a profound final truth. He used his absolute last effort, ignored every doctor's warning, and sacrificed his final chance at rest, all to deliver 5 words that would change a celebrity's life. He lay there, feverish and weak, clinging to the edge of consciousness. His goal wasn't just to see the show, it was to find the woman, Marilyn, and whisper a secret benediction she desperately needed to hear. He was waiting for the light, the chance to execute his final selfless mission. It took every flicker of his remaining life force just to hold his eyes open, steadily gazing at her light. The moment the music hit, Marilyn transformed, becoming the perfect, dazzling fantasy the world demanded. But tonight, the mask was heavier than ever. The band struck up Kiss, and the lights seemed to focus all their energy onto her, carving her into a radiant, impossible figure. She played the part flawlessly, tossing her head back with a laugh that sounded carefree. This was her superpower, convincing the world that all the heartbreak was worth it. But tonight, the performance felt different. She was trying to feed their starved souls, but the energy she received was painful. It felt like a plea. They were men hanging on to a single thread of hope, and she was that thread. She looked over the surging mass of faces. Then she found him. Robbie Vance was exactly where she had seen him. He was isolated from the roaring joy, an island of silence. The contrast created a gravitational pull that drew Marilyn's attention away from every other man. The air immediately surrounding him seemed colder, heavier, charged with the profound finality of his presence. She paused mid-verse, not physically, but internally. Her body continued the polished movements, but her eyes held fast on the young man. She was looking at Private First Class Robbie Vance, but seeing a son, a quiet, pale stranger. And as she looked, something utterly unexpected happened. He opened his eyes. They were large, dark eyes, and in them Marilyn saw not the hunger of a fan, but a weary, gentle pity. He was looking past the diamonds to the sadness she carried. In that brief, terrifying instant of connection, he did not see the goddess, but Norma Jean, the vulnerable woman who was hurting. That look, that recognition from a boy with just days left to live, was the heaviest emotional weight Marilyn had ever felt. The mask that had protected her from studio bosses and failing marriages suddenly felt flimsy. She was supposed to be giving him the fantasy, but he was offering her a devastating piece of the truth. All she could think was that this boy was spending his final moments watching a performance instead of resting. What kind of cruel distraction was she offering? The glittery illusion felt cruel. She was singing, the music was deafening, yet suddenly, all Marilyn could hear was a terrible echoing silence and the voice inside her screaming, "Stop!" She moved into the choreography for Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend, a song entirely about artifice, but the words felt like poison on her tongue. The real Marilyn was trapped beneath, suffocating. Her inner world had collapsed the moment she met Robbie Vance's eyes. There was only him, a quiet, pale accusation against the lie she was telling. She saw his suffering to something universal, his mother's face. Marilyn, who had longed for a loving family, was overwhelmed by a maternal ache. She began to stumble, imperceptibly at first, a half-second pause in her rhythm. All she could think was that this boy was spending his final moments watching a performance. Her mind raced, trapped between her professional duty and this new, overwhelming instinct. The inner debate was a furious, silent battle. They need this. They need the escape. The producers will end the tour. One part of her screamed, but the deeper, truer voice replied, "This is not entertainment. This is a mockery. This boy deserves honesty, not a lie. If you cannot give him the truth, you have no right to be here." The show must go on, the producers always said. But the look in Robbie's eyes was a command more powerful than any director's order. It was a plea for truth. She reached the climax of the song, where she delivered a triumphant laugh, but the sound caught in her throat. Instead of the carefree giggle, a raw, unscripted sob threatened to escape. Her smile felt frozen, a brittle mask of professional resolve that the relentless Korean cold was helping to chip away. The music swelled, pushing her forward, but she fought back. She stepped out of the spotlight's main beam, her face suddenly serious. She looked at the conductor, her expression fierce and unreadable. She knew what she had to do. The mask was coming off. This was the moment where Marilyn Monroe, the creator, had to step aside for Norma Jean, the human being. With her entire being, she signaled the band to stop. She brought her hand down, a sharp, definite motion that cut through the roaring brass. The sudden silence was absolute, a physical shockwave that slammed into the thousands of soldiers and left the entire encampment holding its breath. The music died abruptly, sickeningly, leaving an unnatural, ringing silence that swallowed the tent whole. The thousands of soldiers instantly knew something momentous and completely unplanned was about to happen. She had shattered the grand illusion of Hollywood, choosing the profound reality of one dying boy over the demands of millions. What she did next, stepping out of the light and into the mud, was the most honest performance of her life. The entire tent held its breath as Marilyn Monroe, the world's ultimate fantasy, deliberately stepped out of the light and walked toward the mud and the shadows. The stage manager, Jerry, ran frantically, whispering, "Marilyn, the cameras! What are you doing?" Marilyn ignored him entirely. Her entire focus was locked on the small, fragile figure of Robbie Vance. She moved slowly, her silver heels crunching on the frozen earth. When she stepped off the edge of the stage, her expensive satin dress dragged instantly through the cold gray mud, a potent visual symbol of her choosing reality over glamour. The soldiers who, moments before, had been howling with delight were now utterly silent, watching this unbelievable transformation. They knew that facing the truth, facing the terrible, inescapable fact of a comrade's imminent departure, was the most courageous act possible. Marilyn reached the stretcher and paused. She gently pushed aside the medic, Sergeant Miller, who looked on with astonished eyes. Then, Marilyn Monroe knelt down in the cold, wet mud. She brought herself eye level with the young Marine, shedding the altitude of her fame. She reached out and lightly covered his hand. "Hello, darling," she said, her voice dropping to a soft, genuine register. "What's your name?" Robbie tried to reply. His lips moved, forming shapes that were unintelligible. His eyes, fixed on her face, were wide with disbelief and gratitude. He attempted to lift his hand, but his strength failed him. He was using every last drop of his energy just to remain conscious. "Take your time," Marilyn whispered, leaning in closer. This was simply a woman comforting a son she'd never met. She tucked the blanket tighter around his neck. "My name is Marilyn. I'm awfully glad you came to see me today, Private." He took one long, shuddering breath. He focused entirely on her eyes, drawing on a hidden reservoir of willpower. The silence stretched, becoming agonizing, until finally the words emerged, raspy and barely audible, but perfectly clear to Marilyn, who was just inches away. The words weren't a plea for an autograph or a request for gossip. They were the key to the entire moment, a simple, stunning offering of love from a person facing his last moments to a woman who thought she had nothing left to offer. The 5 words were barely a whisper, a broken, dying breath that had no business being delivered by a soldier to the most famous woman alive. Marilyn knelt there in the mud, waiting for the predictable fan request, but what she received was a selfless, profound, and utterly devastating benediction. He spoke of them not as a fan to a star, but as one fragile soul to another. He managed to force out the words, "I want you to be happy." The sheer, staggering weight of that sentence hit Marilyn with the force of a physical blow. She had braced for the sadness, prepared for the request, but nothing on earth prepared her for the devastating, selfless command that left his lips. Of all the thousands of things this young man facing his final sunset could have asked for, he had chosen her well-being. He was spending his last precious ounces of consciousness not demanding more illusion, but gifting her with the only thing that mattered, a wish for her genuine peace. He had seen her heart break and wanted to relieve her burden. Marilyn's composure, the legendary barrier she had built, shattered. The tears came instantly, hot and stinging against the cold air, carving paths through the carefully applied makeup. She was sobbing, a rough, gasping sound. This was real grief, real empathy, and real shame. Shame that she had been so consumed by her own theatrical sadness when true, inescapable tragedy was right here. She gripped his hand tighter, oblivious to the silence of the tent. "Oh, Robbie," she choked out. "Oh, my darling boy." She wasn't Marilyn Monroe anymore. She was just a woman confronted by pure, selfless love. In those 5 words, the star was gone, replaced by a fierce maternal woman ready to obey a higher command. Robbie smiled, a faint, exhausted lift of the corners of his mouth. It was a smile of profound relief, the look of a man who had completed his final, most important mission. Marilyn leaned her forehead against his. The feeling was overwhelming. She had been searching the world for validation, but this 21-year-old Marine, who had nothing left, had given her the ultimate gift, the spiritual command to prioritize her own joy. He was telling her that her life, her happiness, mattered more than the performance or the fame. When she finally pulled back, her face was streaked with tears, but she was radiant with a profound truth. She met his eyes, her voice now rough, but firm. "I promise you, Robbie," she vowed, "I promise you, in my life, I will try. I will try to be happy just for you." The greatest star in the world had received her marching orders from a dying soldier, and she accepted them unconditionally. But the moment wasn't complete until she gave him something back, something that carried a far greater weight than its material value. The moment was instantly shielded from the cameras by a wall of handlers, but the secret exchange that followed would change the trajectory of Marilyn's life. The sight of the star kneeling in tears was too raw for public consumption. Jerry, the stage manager, finally managed to get control, quickly directing a few Marines to form an impromptu cordon, creating a private, sacred space around Marilyn and Robbie's stretcher. Marilyn was still kneeling, her tears slowing, replaced by a fierce, focused intensity. She was thinking only of Robbie's 5 words. "I want you to be happy." Those words demanded a response that money couldn't buy. She had to give him something just as real. She looked down at her wrist. There, glittering against the mud on her hand, was a heavy, diamond-studded Cartier cuff. It had been a lavish, ill-fated gift from Joe DiMaggio, a symbol of the complicated, brittle life she was trying to escape. With a sudden, decisive motion, Marilyn unclipped the enormous cuff. The metal was cold against her skin. This wasn't just jewelry. It was a physical manifestation of her emotional baggage, and she realized the best way to honor Robbie's wish was to finally put that burden down. She gently took Robbie's frail, bandaged hand again and pressed the cuff firmly into his palm. It was huge and heavy against his thin wrist. "This is yours now, Robbie," she whispered. "This watch has seen every lie and every celebration of my life, but it belongs here with the bravest man I have ever met. I want you to have it." Robbie's eyes widened. He tried to shake his head, but Marilyn stopped him. "You're not taking it, I'm giving it. Big difference," she insisted. "This is the greatest courage I've ever seen. You taught me something today, Private Vance, something Hollywood could never teach me." She leaned in. "And one more thing," she said quietly. "I know your mother watches my movies. I promise you I will call her when I get to Tokyo. I will tell her everything." Robbie nodded, a single confirmation, and the absolute relief that washed over his face was more beautiful than any standing ovation she had ever received. He clutched the cuff to his chest. Marilyn pulled herself up from the cold ground, leaving behind the mud, the tears, and a symbolic piece of her broken past. She returned to the stage a changed woman, ready to face the crowd and deliver a final, profound performance that no one, least of all her, had anticipated. If this story of selfless love and true sacrifice touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that the most profound gifts are always the most unexpected. When she returned to the stage, the diamonds were still dazzling, but the soul behind them was utterly transformed, performing not for fame, but for absolution. Marilyn paused, took one last breath, and wiped the traces of tears from her face. The woman who stepped back onto the platform was not the carefree celebrity. She was a pilgrim who had just witnessed a miracle. The orchestra leader, sensing the gravity, struck a slow, hesitant chord. The music was subdued. The thousands of soldiers were still standing in stunned, reverent silence. They knew that whatever had happened was intensely, sacredly real. Marilyn looked out at the sea of faces, her eyes holding a new depth. She walked slowly to the center, ignoring the microphone stand. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice low and sincere, "I'm sorry we stopped the show, but sometimes life reminds you what matters most." She nodded toward Robbie's stretcher. "I dedicate this final song to a true hero, Private First Class Robert Vance. He taught me more in 5 minutes than Hollywood taught me in 5 years." The words were an honest confession, a public acknowledgement of the profound shift in her soul. She asked the band to play a quiet, tender version of Bye Bye Baby. She sang it not as a flirty farewell, but as a lullaby, delivered straight to Robbie. She sang of journeys and partings, but with an undercurrent of hope, promising a profound, unbroken connection. The entire tent became a cathedral of shared emotion. The soldiers were openly weeping. They were weeping for Robbie and for themselves, seeing their own impending losses reflected in his bravery. The applause that followed was not the sudden, chaotic explosion of a crowd demanding spectacle, but a low, deep, rolling thunder of respect, a sound Marilyn would later call the most honest music she ever heard. Marilyn stood motionless. Her eyes never left Robbie. Before she turned to leave the stage, she gently touched her own wrist, the spot where the cuff had rested, and then offered a small, sincere salute to Private Vance. The performance was officially over, but the secret drama was just beginning. Marilyn walked off stage and immediately faced her handlers. She had a promise to keep, a promise that stretched across continents. Marilyn returned to the bright lights of Tokyo, but the memory of the frozen Korean mud and the soldier's whisper was heavier than any of the baggage she carried. The glamour felt thin, hollow, and utterly meaningless. Her mind was fixed 1,000 miles away. She had a sacred promise to keep. The hardest task was calling Robbie's mother, Elsie Vance. How do you tell a mother that her son, who was facing his end, used his final moments to offer comfort to a stranger? Marilyn paced her suite for hours, dreading the moment she heard Elsie's voice. Finally, she placed the call. When Elsie answered, her voice was quiet, worn down by fear. She had already received the telegram. "Mrs. Vance," Marilyn began, "this is Marilyn Monroe." There was an astonished silence. "Ma'am, I was with your son today, Robbie, in Korea," Marilyn continued. "He is one of the bravest men I have ever met. He came to the show, and he gave me a message I will carry with me forever." Marilyn told Elsie how Robbie had stopped her performance and pressed the Cartier cuff to his heart. Then, Marilyn delivered the crushing, beautiful message. "Mrs. Vance, his 5 words were, 'I want you to be happy.'" Elsie didn't cry. Instead, she let out a profound sigh of recognition. She understood instantly. Her Robbie, ever the giver, had used his final wish not selfishly, but to try and bring light to someone else's struggle. "That's my boy," Elsie finally whispered, filled with heartbreaking pride. "He always worried about other people's smiles." Marilyn had anticipated resistance, perhaps even anger, that her celebrity presence had pulled Robbie away from his rest. Instead, she was met with gratitude and an understanding of the depth of Robbie's own sacrifice. This moment, this intimate conversation between 2 women separated by fame and a continent, was a true confirmation of Robbie's purity. Elsie did not ask for money or favors. She simply asked Marilyn to keep her son's final message alive. Marilyn refused to let the kindness end there. She immediately contacted her most trusted private manager, issuing a series of unprecedented, relentless orders. She insisted on locating the best medical care available, regardless of cost. Within 48 hours, Marilyn used her immense secret influence to fly specialists from Tokyo to the field hospital in Busan. She arranged for experimental treatments, making sure Robbie had every possible resource for his comfort and his recovery, however brief it might be. She was performing again, but this time the performance was an act of grace and ferocious protection for a boy who had asked nothing of her. She had given him the promise of happiness, and he had given her a purpose more fulfilling than all of her fame combined. But as Marilyn flew back to America, a simple, painful truth remained waiting in Korea, a truth that would deliver the final, quiet message of a life well lived. Robbie Vance passed away 3 weeks later, but his final, selfless act on the farthest shore gave Marilyn Monroe a gift more lasting than any career. The specialists Marilyn had flown in confirmed the grim prognosis, but their efforts ensured that Robbie's final weeks were spent in comfort. He held on to the heavy, diamond-studded Cartier cuff right up until the end. Marilyn received the news not in a formal report, but in a telegram forwarded to her hotel. It was from Elsie Vance, and it contained only 4 words. He was happy. Thank you. That simple message was Marilyn's true payoff, a cathartic release. She realized Robbie had died, not just peacefully, but having accomplished his final true wish. The encounter changed Marilyn. She never spoke about Private First Class Robert Vance publicly. This was her secret sacrament, but her actions spoke volumes. Quietly, anonymously, Marilyn Monroe established a foundation in Robbie's name. It was a secret fund, managed by her most trusted lawyer, dedicated to providing advanced care and emotional support to servicemen and servicewomen injured in the conflict. Millions of her own dollars went to this cause over the following years, always anonymous, always steady. The money replaced the fleeting vanity of the Cartier cuff she had given away. Robbie's 5 words, "I want you to be happy," became her personal, invisible mantra. It was a constant internal check against the constant demands of Hollywood artifice. She realized that the true power of her fame wasn't the ability to attract attention, but the capacity to provide dignity and relief to those who desperately needed it. When the papers buzzed with rumors, Marilyn would often touch her bare wrist, remembering the weight of the diamonds now resting with Robbie. The encounter with the dying soldier gave her a clear moral compass. Robbie had come to the show to see a goddess. Marilyn left Korea having met her angel. She lived the rest of her life constantly seeking to matter more than she sought to shine. The little boy on the stretcher taught the biggest star on earth that the most important performance isn't on a stage, but in the quiet, profound moments of selfless love. If this story reminded you that the greatest strength is found in selfless love, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell for more stories about the hidden human moments behind Hollywood's biggest legends.